There it is. Well, welcome everybody. We are so thrilled to be hosting another McNally virtual event, and we're so thrilled to be celebrating Victoria's wonderful book. So I'm going to hand over to these wonderful poets we have here in a moment. I'll just do some quick housekeeping and some welcomes to begin with. So we are thrilled to welcome Victoria Redel and to celebrate the launch of her fourth collection of poems, Paradise. Rewriting Eden, Victoria Redel interrogates the idea of paradise within the historical context of borders, exile, and diaspora that has brought us to the global migration crisis. Drawing on a long family history of flight and refuge, poems in Paradise interweave religion, myth, personal law, and nation building, borders actual and imagined. They ask, what if what we fell from was never actually grace? What is the boundary really? So she will be reading tonight, and she is the author of 4 books of poetry and 5 books of fiction, including her newly published book of poems, Paradise. A recipient of fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation, the NEA, Redel's work has been widely anthologized, translated, and published in over 10 countries. And Victoria is joined tonight by Pádraig Tuama. He's a poet and theologian from Ireland. He presents Poetry Unbound from Being on Studios. With publications in poetry, prose, conflict resolution, and theology, his work has been widely featured in journals and national broadcasters in Ireland, the UK, Australia, New Zealand, and the USA. He is currently in New York working with the Center of Cooperation and Conflict at Columbia University. Marie Howe is the author of 4 books of poetry, most recently Magdalen. So I'm going to hand over to these lovely poets. Before I do, there is going to be time for questions at the end, so feel free to put any questions in the Zoom chat, and we'll definitely get to them. All right, I'll hand over to you, Victoria.
Hi, welcome everyone. So nice to see people's faces. Thank you all for coming. And I'm so excited to be here with Marie and with Pádraig. It's just kind of thrilling. So what I think we're going to do is I'm going to read 4 or 5 poems. I was trying to get them to read 4 or 5, but they were like, no, no, no. And if people know Marie, you know how strict she is when she says no. But then they will each read a poem, and we'll start to talk and hopefully each read more poems as it goes on. So just to sort of set up this book, Paradise, a little bit, and also why it felt so perfect to me to be here in conversation with both Pádraig and Marie, is that it's a kind of midrash in a way to be able to talk with them. This book, Paradise, engages or started with this first poem that I wrote that I'll read called Garden. And I had been working on a novel, and then sort of in a very dry period, thinking I didn't know what the poems were that I felt like I needed to write at this point in my life, and at this point in thinking about the world. And then this poem sort of happened, and it led me to the other poems inside of this book. So this is a poem called The Garden, or Garden. And although it doesn't name who the persona is, I think we'll get who the we is kind of in it pretty clearly. Garden. In the first weeks, we already knew this was history, that you'd speak of our nakedness, the flat grasses we wove and slipped over each other. First, there were frills of green leaf, stalks, tips too. Later came wild onion, the sharp tang of shoot and bulb, then peaches. Standing together in sunlight, of course, praise and song. We hardly cared that you would get so much of it wrong, that you would always speak of an apple or claim that one of us was so persuaded by the snake. Darlings, we imagined you. Over and over, how you would break each other, wound this garden. Only then, still licking the dried peach juice sticky down our fingers, did we know shame. And once that poem sort of happened, and as poems do, sort of came a little bit out of nowhere, I decided to pursue it. And this is a poem called Snake. I don't think it needs a lot of setup, only to say that when my sons were quite young, as you'll hear in this poem, they persuaded me that what we needed was a corn snake. And we had this teeny little corn snake, which I think we had for maybe 14 years, although the boys lost interest in the snake probably after about year 3 or 4. So this snake became my business, snake. After at most a year, maybe 2, showing off how it circled their necks, slid down and out the bottom of a t-shirt, how they fed mice on ice from an open palm, jaw unhinging to take it whole. My sons had no time for the snake when she'd go milky-eyed, slowing until her dry length coiled into days and days of such gray stillness, I'd knock the glass tank to make sure she was alive. Then maybe I'd be making the bunk bed or folding baseball pants when the edging began, a restless roughing against bark chips, rubbing forward along every available friction until the split when she'd press out of herself, leaving the long opaque shed. I loved it every time. I don't mean the emergence, though yes, there was that, how she'd fold and stretch glossy and clear-eyed. No, I loved the papery scaled ghost I'd lift up, not to commemorate her chance to begin again, but the cold indifference to whom she'd been. So this book also coincided, or as my life coincided with all sorts of world events, the increasing number of global refugees from countries at war, from climate, from countries where they're fleeing from climate. Towards the end of my father's life with the TV on, he was, my father was a political refugee, and many of the poems in this book also deal with those expulsions, but this is a poem called Refugees. In the last days, when he could barely open his eyes, he'd look up from the hospital bed, lift his hand and say, "That's me." And we'd say, "Yes, Papa, you're right here." "No," he said, jabbing his fingers towards the television, clusters of makeshift tents bent under gusting winds, a child held over the rail of a listing boat. Or he pointed at lines of young men, squatting men slouched against stone walls, sweatshirts tied around waists, a few smoking cigarettes. "No," he said, waving toward men browner and blacker than he. "You think that's not me?" he said. "You, look again." This is a poem called Expulsion. Oh, no, it's not. But I'm going to read a poem called Expulsion. So this poem takes off from there and goes really kind of directly into a notion of expulsion. It's a prose poem, so it's kind of a thicker looking poem. Down to help out with the cooking, the shopping, driving to dialysis clinic, paying the unpaid bills, managing the ever-growing array of unmanaged situations. So mornings and evenings, I also took out my father's dog, Teddy, an apricot poodle who, at the very first sight of another dog, any dog, every damn walk, let's say for this evening's purpose, the bull mastiff walked by a small bent over gentleman who was once, like my father, clearly a taller man, the spine in its seemingly inevitable compression. My father's poodle, at the sight of this bull mastiff, barked, yapped, leapt, bit at the air, bit at his leash, but I kept walking. So the dog with its snapping and twisting antics was half dragged, half aloft. And the gentleman asked with his elegant Spanish, maybe Venezuelan, maybe Cuban or Salvadoran accent, "How's he doing?" By which it was clear he meant my father, not the poodle. I said, fine, thank you, yanking the dog, now airborne, like a cartoon version of a frustrated, furious dog. And the gentleman said, your father and me, all us refugees, same story. While he bent his already bent over body slowly, slowly to the ground to scoop up his mastiff's monumental shit. And then even slower, with the dog waiting patiently beside him, the gentleman managed, actually leaning on his dog for balance, to gather himself upright, and holding the bag, he turned, dropped it in the mesh wastebasket and said, not for babies, this business. This is a poem called Speaking of Men. And this was also a really early poem in the book. And I'm reading it for Marie, who I think liked it then. Speaking of men. Then began the exemptions. My sons, your brothers, grandfathers who left with nothing. A neighbor boy who put hands to where hands had been put on him. The drugged boy, beaten boy, hunted boy, lost boy, starved boy, forgotten boy, skittish boy, boy of a mother who had 3 jobs, soft boy, strapped down boy, transit boy, boy who watched what should never be watched, boy given the gun, boy who can't sleep remembering what was done and what he did when the burnt sky fell and he saw the other broken boys scatter and begin to run. And I'm going to read one more and then I'll turn it over to Marie and to Pádraig. This is a poem called You Called It Paradise. The gate had a broken latch. A thin, curved deer rib fastened it shut. Every day, we walked out to the mossy edge. We were restless. It is not true that we fled at the end or that it was an end. When we found the gate, of course we opened it. Marie, will you read something?
Absolutely. After a moment of silence, hearing those gorgeous poems. Everyone here can imagine how happy I am to be here to celebrate Victoria. I know I speak for us all. You know, to have watched these poems come forth over the last years has been a joy. And it's just, I think this book is the most amazing book. I mean, it's not only midrash about entering these old stories, but it's entering the stories that are happening right now. And, you know, exile, transformation, nothing could be more important right now to think about and talk about. And so I'm going to read the first poem I ever wrote that I kept that was a kind of midrash. It's very small. It's a little prose poem and it's called Parted Eve's Discussion. It was like the moment when a bird decides not to eat from your hand and flies. Just before it flies, the moment the rivers seem to still and stop because a storm is coming, but there is no storm, is when 100 starlings lift and bank together before they wheel and drop. Very much like the moment driving on bad ice, when it occurs to you your car could spin just before it slowly begins to spin. Like the moment just before you forgot what it was you were about to say. It was like that. And after that, it was still like that, only all the time. So Padráig?
It's such a joy to be part of this launch for Victoria's book. I got it yesterday and read it yesterday and overwhelmed by the extraordinary way where myth and text and speculation about untold parts of stories, as well as speculation about untold parts of a family's story, an untold part of a planet's story, are all woven together. Sometimes you wonder, what are we reading? Is it about then or now? Time is doing all kinds of things at the same time in these magnificent poems. So that's the most important thing to say. Here's the book. Marie and I were both threatening that we'd just spend the whole time like this as some kind of Marie's doing it, as some kind of subliminal message to say what an extraordinary journey this is. I have a short sonnet. This sonnet was doctored by Spencer Rees, who lots of us know. Spencer read it and said, "I love it. Get rid of the second half." So I got rid of the second half. It is a poem about Jacob and Esau, two brothers, biblical characters who were kind of set up. Their father was Isaac, a very distressed character. And these two brothers are almost like the two halves of his argument. And I don't know where this poem came from, and I'm not entirely sure who it's about. Jacob and Esau. One day, I repented my resentment because I realized I'd forgotten to repeat it. For a long while, it was like a prayer, rising to the skies morning after morning, like a siren that wouldn't quiet. Then I remembered other things, the way I walk lighter these days, the way you never knew my story of divorce, the way I am tired of being forced among the new, the way I miss having someone to speak to about things I don't need to explain, the way we shared a name. I decided. I took a flight and hung around the areas where we used to meet. I loitered with intent. I was hungry but couldn't eat alone. I missed the home your body was, even though we're grown now. I missed your smell, your wrestle, your snoring breath. And when I saw you change too. So much behind us we didn't need to name. Back to Victoria.
So should we jump into a little conversation about why we all come to these poems, or why we keep returning to parts of, whether it's the Old Testament, primarily for me, but I think for both of you, but both the Old and the New Testament, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that's probably the simplest question, right?
Well, the stories are vast, right? And there's so much not said in them and every one of these stories happens in our lives in some way, whether or not, I mean, each of us has known what it's like to have lived in a certain world that changed just by any number of ways. What I think you do so well, Vic, is like I'm looking at the poem Exodus, which I have never heard you read, but I would love you to read it, because this notion, how your father's history and so many people's history is blended somehow with the story of Moses and a people. And I mean, I just think it's extraordinary how you blend them in many of the poems. I mean, in my grandmother's trunk, I found, you even bring in a children's game. Anyway, I hope you read it. If not now, then a little later, if you want to. Because so much of it is that if we don't know the stories of people, soon that they're not there to ask. And I feel that about my family. I don't have old stories from my family. We didn't talk about old stories. My parents didn't look back. So you have this history with your father and your great-grandfather and your great-great-grandfather that I envy, really, even if it's one of struggle and exile. Yeah. It has nothing to do with Midrash, but there it is. I just been thinking about that.
And And Pádraig, I mean, I feel like so many of, I mean, obviously both you and Marie, I feel like both of you have so many poems that, you know, Marie's whole book, Magdalen, and that beautiful poem of yours, Not Yet, that goes right into that world. I mean, you were steeped in it, but you were also steeped in a childhood in a country had, you know, in conflict, in the Troubles, right? So
Yeah.
how, I mean, that seems to twine so much in your work.
Yeah, I suppose I'm curious about the way within, well, like when I was growing up, I always thought that the stories of the Bible were the real stories, back when God used to talk. And then I was studying theology, but I was really frightened. And so I was studying theology, trying to get the answers right. And I took a course with some Jewish people who then became friends. I didn't know them at the start, but I did by the end. And over meals, one of them said to me, "You ask terrible questions." And they were asking me to pay attention to the text in a way where God wasn't some frightened teenager who couldn't cope with a serious question. But that actually also asked me to pay attention to myself and to pay attention to the Ireland I grew up in, to the experiences I'd had, to the things that were consolations and the things that were desolations, and to the things that I needed to object to. And so I think in a certain sense, my fear of the idea of religion was in a strange way an abdication of responsibility. And their challenge to me was an invitation to take everything more seriously: humor and God and violence and Ireland and colonization. And then suddenly all these doors opened in the texts to go, my God, I can write about these things, about Ireland and about that. And that's what I think is so extraordinary in yours, is we, in this book, we start off in Eden, and then just quietly in maybe the fifth or sixth poem, you go, oh, we're in Eden, but we're also somewhere else. And then the somewhere else becomes louder. And as the book comes to an end, we're back in Eden, but we're in many other places at the same time too. You hold these times together in a way that I think is so interesting. Did that happen naturally, Victoria? Was it deliberate? Were you aware of what was happening?
There's a yes and a no answer to that. So
of course there is.
when I wrote that poem, Garden, and I thought, oh, wow, it felt really daring, you know. I love persona poems, and in another book, in my first book of poems, there was a persona poem in which I was Hagar. But to kind of wander right into Eden felt for me daring, and mostly because I wasn't sure I knew why I was there. And then more and more became clear to me. You know, to also answer Marie's thought, well, both my parents came to this country, and you know, I've realized that myself and my sister are both the first members of our generation, of our family, to have children in the same country we were born in for multiple generations. So I come from, well, my parents didn't speak very much about either of their lives, and were sort of protective of us in our childhood in that kind of going forward way. The sense of dislocation, even when they didn't talk about it, the sense of disaster kind of hung in over the house, or that there was impending disaster, or you're not really an American, or you are, be more American, but don't be American. Sort of the mode in our house, which I don't think is unusual in a lot of first generation households. But there was also, as I started writing the poems, I wanted to walk into those places in both my father's and my mother's and my grandparents' lives, and my great-great-grand, you know, all these places where I know and I don't know, and that I could live with the knowing and the not knowing, that the book would hold that, and began to think about, well, expulsion or exile is old business, right? That's so much of the Bible is about expulsion and exile and return, and finding one's way. And so it led me to that. But I also began to think, and I think this is what you're talking about the migration inside of my own life, whether it's, sort of literally the migrations of my body, as the aging body, which sort of comes into the last section of poems pretty rampantly, whether it's the aging body, the sexual body, all of those things, as they changed over a lifetime of thinking, and it connected me with old stories as well as older and older stories. So.
I'm thinking as you're saying, Vic, I don't know, I did know, I didn't know, I couldn't know. And back to what you were saying, Pádraig, growing up Catholic, we had a catechism, right? There were answers. Why did God make me? God made me to know him and love him in this world and to be happy with him in the next, right? Like there were answers. And the greatness of poetry, of course, is that it resists answers, and midrash resists answers. Thank God for Jewish midrash that we don't have to. I mean, Wallace Stevens, says, finally, God and the imagination are one. And that we get to participate in these stories, co-creating them, forever. I mean, as long as they exist, people will be co-creating these stories and adding to them, and not a single one will be considered wrong, because God and the imagination are one. And your book is so holds that, within its negative capability and its ability to hold so many possibilities at once. I think that's the great freedom of writing through these old stories.
Well, once you start to do it, right, you start to, we live in a moment where there's so many questions that we're all asking, or I guess every moment is a period of time where all those questions are being asked. But when I began to think about naming the animals, for example, like the simplest thing, I was like, well, we mean we named the animals just because we had language. What, they didn't exist prior? What, they aren't without a name, and the absurdity of that felt contemporary to me.
Well, every poem about Eden is an eco poem,
Mm-hmm.
I share your poems with my eco poets, because they are, every single one of them. Would you read some more, Vic?
Sure.
Would you read the first poem of the whole book, The Border?
I will. The Border. There was a gate, and through the gate, another garden. Same grasses, clover, gentian violet, and lily. And the dry winds also made those willows sway. Just that rusty gate, the dirt beneath scraped when it hinged open, then shut. And some claimed one side was paradise.
There it is.
Here, I'll read that Exodus poem for you, and then maybe Pádraig and you'll read one. Just spin off of one of these. Exodus. So this poem is in little sections. Here we go. Exodus. We came from somewhere, had a village, and then didn't. Trees broke in wind, a river went dry, men arrived, a gang, a mob, more by night, fires were set, then rain pressed through a neighbor's door. We salvaged spoon and shoe, but might have chosen better. We knew the importance of bedding. It's simple math, the want and the want and the want. Don't talk about one long list of sorry. Let's go, we say, standing still. In my grandmother's trunk, I found a boat. In my grandmother's trunk, I found a boat and a train. In my grandmother's trunk, I found a boat, a train, August wind, the river Prout, an uncle in prison, a book of addresses, a box of faces. Identity papers were stamped. At some point, our name twisted to local consonants. Look at the box of faces, worry and dignity. What to do with the careful dress, the good suit, the unpeeled orange in an open hand. In smudged pencil on the back of each face, names I don't recognize. No one left to ask. Maria's, before you read, I think that poem actually started, just to think of its origin, not in the Bible's Exodus, but really in the news, in the daily newspaper, in reading something about people having to leave and take what they had from a house or a nothing or a flood, or and it was overwhelming. And as I started to write it, I thought, oh, it sounds almost like a fable or a parable or a story. And then I thought, no, it's current. And then inside of it were things, again, that were known and misknown by me. I have an uncle, a great uncle, who indeed spent 5 years in a Romanian prison. And the lore in my household was that he had spent those 5 years in prison because he had translated the manifesto from Russian into Romanian. And that's like I later learned when, or at least I hung on to it as that story. And I later learned it wasn't that he was the official translator of the manifesto and he got thrown in jail. In fact, he was just kind of making pamphlets, that were stealing things from the manifesto and inserting them. He'd gotten conscripted into the Romanian army, and he kept handing out manifestos until they kept saying, stop it or we're going to put you in jail. And then they really put him in jail for 5 years. So in solitary.
I mean, that means how many minutes
Right.
in solitary? How many minutes is 5? We can say 5 years in prison, but it's like a minute.
Yeah. Yeah. He was indeed one of the most, can't spend our whole time on my Uncle Montes, but he is worthy of a whole hour. He, when I met my Uncle Montes, once he got out of prison, he was given the chance. He had to leave the country. So of course he said, well, I'm going to Russia. So we went to Russia, and it was right in time for Stalin's purges. And he went to stay with an uncle in Moscow and got thrown right back into jail. But my Uncle Montes was this light, this brilliant, beautiful light of a human being, beautiful man. Will you read something, Marie?
Yeah, I'm just trying to think. I had an idea and now I'm changing it. Well, I guess I'll be a little subversive because one of the great things about returning to these stories, which have been with me my whole life, as many of us, is trying to, especially the women in the New Testament, what we call the New Testament, were so, they were depicted as men would have depicted them. So much of my life has been trying to reimagine and give them a voice that they never had in the stories. So I'm going to read one of the Magdalen poems. Magdalen was, of course, often when we were kids, depicted always as a prostitute. And she wasn't probably a prostitute at all. She was most likely a woman who was wanting to follow a spiritual teacher, which was already a radical act in her life. But more than that, just to contemporize her, I wanted her to be a woman who was not ashamed of her sexuality, and that she didn't have to be a prostitute to have known men and to have enjoyed them even and had relationships with them. And she could be the subject of her life instead of the object of someone else's. So here's Magdalen talking about on men, their bodies. One penis was very large and thick, so when he put it inside me, I really did say, wow. One penis was uncircumcised, and I loved to grip the shaft and pull down so the head popped out like a little man. One penis was curved, so I had to move in a different way. One penis was so friendly, I was never afraid of it. One penis was so slender, I was startled. One penis was blunt and short, like a small pig. One penis couldn't harden until he stuffed it soft inside me. One penis came as soon as I started to move. I'm so sorry, he said. I have a problem. But I didn't care. I loved that boy. One penis pressed against me hard almost every morning, but I got out of bed as if I hadn't heard a word it had said. One penis was so dear to me, I kissed it, even after I knew it had been with someone else. One penis I never saw, but my hand came to know it from the outside of his jeans. One penis loved the inside of my mouth so much, it sang, it sputtered. One had a name. One was a mouse. One, he explained to me, had very, very tiny crabs, so we couldn't have sex for a while. One was orthodox and wouldn't touch blood. One had a mole, a hard little dot just under the rim. One penis was extremely patient without making a big deal about it. One penis had a great sense of humor. One penis had herpes, but I didn't know that word yet. One was a battering ram. One was a drunk, staggering, a lout, a bully. One slept inside me, comfortably at home.
I love that.
Yes, that's Magdalen.
Padráig.
I'm thinking about the stories we use and the way that we engage with them, and I suppose it's their wildness that always strikes me, and that the spaces between the letters, whether those spaces are large or not, or the spaces between the lines, are the spaces, the blank spaces that call out for all kinds of projections, and they resist being commodified into a single dogma or doctrine or narrative about a life. And that's the same with the history too. How do we find a way within which we inhabit the history of a country through the history of our family as they've survived that country or fled that country? So here's a short poem called Let the Waters Swarm with a Swarm of Living Beings. I've been swimming around here for a while now, and while I've never touched the ocean floor, I've tried. You notice things out here, the way the wind makes waves chop at odd angles, the way the water feels warmer at the top, the way the moon makes music when you're half dead with cold, the ways of frozen bones, the way the morning never feels the same. Once a seal bumped me, came right up to me like a sea puppy, and I swear he smiled. I was floating happy after that. I said, the ocean is my home. Then a storm came, then the waves, then the lightning spiked the surface, thunder clapped, hungry beasts swam round me. I saw seagulls eyeing me for scraps. Back over to you, Victoria.
What's that beautiful line? The storm spiked. Read that line again.
The storm spiked the surface.
Oh, that's so beautiful.
Oh.
So visual.
Actually, partly that poem was inspired by having spent 2 years reading Emily Dickinson's, all of her poems and all of her letters. And somebody said to me at the end, wow, you must really understand her work now. And I was like, what are you on about? I haven't a clue about her work. So the idea was the idea that it's kind of like trying to conquer the sea by swimming in it. You're like, my God, I am at the mercy of it. And I just hope I survive. And that's the same, I think, with any narrative, a family one, a country's one, a religious one.
Growing in Eden.
Yeah, exactly.
Vic, I want you to write a poem that starts the way you were saying a little while ago when you said, when I was first found myself in these stories, well, I didn't know what I was doing there. I love that.
I'll write that down, Marie. Take
I didn't know what I
instruction.
was doing there. Yeah, it's such a beautiful thing. It's like they really are a place, you know, they're a place to stand.
Yeah. I do feel like inside of my family, I always kind of had a curiosity for those things, whatever it was, you know. I was always rummaging through my grandmother's photographs and trying to get her to tell me another story and another story, and kind of stitching my own tableau of what the life was, and it felt very, you know, as alive to me as the life I was having, you know, on my dead end street. I have to say that's for sure. Okay, let's see. Should I jump off of one of your poems?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to jump off of Marie's to read a little bit of a. Not one I thought I was going to read tonight, so there you go. This is a poem called Ode After Menopause.
Oh, yeah,
but,
baby.
I think it's, well, I don't think it's Magdalen so much as, you know, maybe anyone. You know, for me, maybe for every person, but certainly as a woman, each passage of being a woman was like a gate. You know, wow, nobody talked about, you know, how hard it was to get pregnant or pregnancy until you're trying to do it. And then there's all these stories, all these women come forward with it. And I never really entered into thinking about the aging body, because why would I when I had a younger body, right? So this is a poem called Ode After Menopause. I think people have very different experiences, but I miss the blood, the plush, thick insistence, lunar declaration, my flag. Then years living together, mysterious reconciling, not that we were always a sister nation, didn't bitch, get bitchy, blame everything on a knot that belly down rumped me to my knees, and those gym passes, coach too embarrassed to challenge how it stretched on for weeks. Now I'm missing cash registers where I averted my eyes, the rectangle box of public admission. And yes, let's bless the shyness of teenage boys bagging, handing back change. And what happened between us, a moment electric. What was it? Cringe, tease, apology, brag, that we were actually bodies walking around with the whole screwy, beautiful, damaged human history of bodies. And blessed too the anti-corporate vinegar cleansed sponges and menstrual cup years I bannered to take back body and night. And let this be praised, how his cock looked crimson sheathed, how his face came up smeary and I tasted iron on his tongue. Destroyers we were, sheets, mattress, my own sticky fingers, our carnage, and oh, that muscled relief of coming. And then just after cleaned out days, follicular ovules burst, dropping luteal. Call this batshit nostalgic, but here's to the crazy making late months, that haze of calculation and fret, stalled in doorways, practicing conversations I didn't want. Once on my knees in a summer field, I prayed. Then the stain of forgiveness like blessing. Here, right now, an official thank you to every public library, office, gas station, airplane, restaurant, concert, porta potty, state park, bathroom, where behind latch stalls I angled in smooth cardboard, and also to strangers, ladies who helped when I was an empty purse, not a scrounge coin to turn the metal dispensary. For this nest I shed month after year after decade, like it was nothing, a tag along, the occasional few, the other times the rebuke, fertility failure, but never once did I acknowledge, did I really consider what it gave the rest of me, brain, skin, bones, tissue, memory, sleep, mood, until it was gone for months, then back out of whack, roller coaster of a coda, odd day, the whole month wallops uncontainable, dinners or meetings unfinished before torrent, final rampage, this sorcery of woman the ancients believed could stop lightning, and then it stopped, really, forever, period. Pádraig, want to read something? We're supposed to do questions at some point. So if you have questions, you can put them in the thing. Otherwise, we'll just keep yakking.
I have a really short one that I'll read. Actually, the very first time I met Marie was at a meal on the other side of Central Park, and we instantly knew that we knew each other. And Marie said to me, "What poem are you working on now?" And I could remember it because it's very short. And she said, "Tell it to me." And we were at a meal. And so she leaned in and I said this poem. And I wasn't quite finished it. And Marie said, "Stop it right there." And so I did. And so here is a poem. It also picks up on questions to do with the Bible and masculinity and gender. And this poem is called "Your Descendants Will Be As Many as the Stars." Wanting to be a father isn't the same as wanting to have a son. One and one sometimes still makes one. A man once said to me that because he had 3 daughters, there must be something weak about his penis. When his wife gave him a boy, he was overjoyed. That's where Marie said stop.
Yeah, that goes right into all the old stories.
Well,
That makes
yeah.
primary.
And it shows, I think, the way that the danger of those stories and taking those stories as their own interpretation of themselves has led to so many of the oppressions that are informing so many of the poems that you're writing in this book, Victoria, as well as Marie's work. That a singular imagination about the interpretation of a story, it becomes a dictatorship to the imagination, and that will always result in violence.
Yeah.
Does anybody have questions for Victoria or comments? Suddenly, you guys are all talkers.
Yeah. Well, we can keep talking.
You can put the question in the chat, or you can just raise your hand or you unmute.
Jump in. I was like, drop questions here. Oh, that's McNally.
Okay, so Catherine Williams, who says, "I'd love to hear more poems." So Vic, I think that's what you ought to do.
Okay, well, I'll read another poem. This is a poem called Occupation, and jumps sort of over. Hey, this is impressive. I realize I haven't worn my eyeglasses the whole time, my reading glasses. Now I'm going to put my reading glasses on. My mother, again, sort of in partial stories, left Romania and got to Paris, where she and her father and mother stayed for 2 years under German occupation and during the Vichy government before they left, and they had Persian passports, and so considered themselves somewhat safe for a while. Occupation. My mother bled when the Germans entered Paris. She was 9. The red rust ran a wet track in her underpants like a skid mark from the soldier's motorcycle stationed at the corner of Rue de Messine. How could she tell her parents? She was in love with the handsome soldier who squatted next to her to scratch Bijou's puppy ear. "You're a fine young lady," he said, impressed with her German. She'd been hit right then, kicked in the belly by the dimpled smile he smiled at her. Better than the smiles of all her first loves. Buster Crabbe, Carrie and Gary and Henri Garat. Wasn't this the truer cinema? He'd been commanded to kill her, but their love he can't fire and only wounds her, a bloody hurt no one else can see. She'll never tell. My mother washes out her cotton underpants, hides them in the armoire to dry, lies flat on the bed to quiet the blood. In the shuttered living room, her parents argue again. They could still get to Bordeaux. Maybe they'd been wrong turning back on the crowded road. Isn't the occupation safer with Persian papers they won't be forced to register? But my mother knows her soldier must know the truth. It's part of their beautiful tragedy to hold her bloody and bandaged in his arms as she confesses, I'm a Jew. Natalie, darling, he'll say, I'll always protect you, and nibble Bijou's ears. His smile, he'll carry her home. He'll show her parents there's no reason to hide. I had the great chance in going through papers as we were cleaning out my parents' apartment to find documents. I hadn't known where my mother and her family lived when they were in France. And then I found a document that gave 2 addresses and realized that one of them was the street that the address of their home, and the other was what I thought was probably where my grandfather tried to open up a business. And just in October, the October right before COVID, we went to Paris, my sister and I, and delivered some of my father's ashes into the Seine, and found the street where my mother lived and where my grandfather worked. So it's quite striking experience.
Vic, would you
Or at
read-
least we think that's the story.
Yeah. Would you read Another Garden?
Sure.
It's the last poem in the book, yeah?
Okay.
I just think it's such a beautiful poem, given what you've just been saying.
Another garden. We set cairns to find our way back, but we did not turn back. Ahead, the river branched. Swallows curved, dipped into dusk. Midges hatched, sketched across inlets. We never turned back. Before us, around us, a great unfathomable forest, then desert. When we were frightened, we tried to recall when we had stopped piling the great stone markers. A gold dragonfly landed with net wings, another's iridescent blue wings. We stopped worrying that fear would end. We did not turn back. We had yet to imagine something we could not imagine, though we would, and we had begun. That was just thinking about, someone was asking about order. It's the last poem in the book, but it was the second to last poem that I wrote in the book. So there was another poem that came in sort of almost after the book was fully done, but that came as a final poem.
What was that poem?
That's a poem. It's a weird one to read a little bit. That's called We Petition You, Sirs. So among those documents that I found a group of letters that my father and my great uncle had written to the Polish government and to the American government, first in 1946, trying to locate family members, and just trying to say, you know, my brother, his wife, the kids, we don't have any record of where they were. Do you have any record? And then it moved on to their home, you know, and their property, and as family members. So it went from 1946 to up until I think the 80s was finally when they basically said there's no record of the property, no nothing, finished. So this poem uses some lines from the letters, and then it uses other things to sort of enlarge the question of the lost. So that was the last poem.
I was going to ask if you could read Tributary, Victoria, because there's a way within which Tributary is almost dealing with the tree of knowledge, kind of asking how is it that I know these things, even though I'm not supposed to know these things? And in the midst of uncovering data and documents, there's also almost like the memory in the DNA that you speak about so powerfully, and knowledge becomes this complicated thing. I'd love to hear it.
Sure, I'd love to read that one. Tributary. Is it just me, or does every immigrant's child have memories of a marshy bank overflowing and someone gutting fish? If I'm walking the path, hugging the Hudson, how is it I'm in Romania, birthing my mother in a high bed in another home the family abandons just in time? Come on, I'm nobody's child anymore. Everything is just in time. Another war in another disputed city, wrapped in a frayed kilim, my days crowded and official, 5 years of bribe the guard takes while Matis wastes in solitary. Nights in the Ural Mountains, displaced persons camp, Aunt Riva's frozen toeless feet burn against my legs. Now a lush spring, floods of refugees camp along the Seine, and Persian papers keep a star off my mother's coat. Then memories torrent, the boat tipped, suitcases lost, lines of history snapped. I'm wrist sunk, searching the tributary of the Prut and Danube. A tugboat nudges a freighter up the ice-chunked Hudson. My vigilance recovers nothing more than the tang of silt and pike. It costs even still to cross to the other side. Thanks. I like reading that one. I haven't tried reading that poem aloud really anywhere.
I love the come on. It's just such a fascinating voice in the speaker of that poem.
Will one of you read one before we, I think, have to go at 6 or 7, whatever, 8, whatever time it is? Marie, you have a small one you want to read? A small, large one. We can't hear you.
Mary, has often, Mary, who was the mother of Jesus, was always a very compelling person to me. You know, because I don't believe the virgin story unless you mean virgin in the way Meister Eckhart means, which is a simplicity of soul, absolutely simple, so that she could actually receive a visit from the divine. I think of her anyway. So I think I want to read the Enunciation, which is just a 14-line poem, very brief, when Mary's trying to tell us what it was like to have this visitation from something huge. Some people call it an angel. Enunciation. Even if I don't see it again, nor ever feel it, I know it is. And that if once it hailed me, it ever does. And so it is myself I want to turn in that direction, not as towards a place, but it was a tilting within myself. As one turns a mirror to flash the light to where it isn't, I was blinded like that and swam in what shone at me, only able to endure it by being no one. And so specifically myself, I thought I'd die from being loved like that.
You're muted, Victoria.
You're muted, Vic.
I love that poem so much. And at some point, I would love to have a conversation with writers about itness. The way that the it functions in that poem is so great. All the it.
Your you thing, Padráig. Yeah, the itness. But there's a lot of great poems with it.
Yeah.
It in it.
Right. With it in it.
It in it.
Are we supposed to are we supposed to say it's time?
It's time. I think that's a lovely note to end on. Thank you all so much for reading those wonderful poems and for that wonderful conversation, everyone for coming out tonight. That was just wonderful. I hope you all enjoyed it as much as I did. You can purchase Victoria's book at McNally Jackson. We hope you do.
Yes, do it at McNally Jackson.
And you can look at our website. We've got some more virtual and more in-person events coming up. So we hope to see you all very soon. Thank you all again. Thank you, Victoria, and congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you, Marie. Thank you, Pádraig. Thank you, Michaela. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. It was awesome.
Okay, so
This is always
Beautiful, beautiful reading.
Really beautiful.
All of you.
All three of you. We were all listening, including the dog.
good.
these are always very abrupt to end, so I'm very sorry. I have to end it for everyone, but thank you all so much. Bye.
Okay.